Welcome top news today.
In this image from video from Senate television, Senator Paul RKy speaks on the floor of the Senate Thursday ahead of a vote on a budget bill that increased spending dramatically. APAP More than 70% of Republicans in the House and Senate happily voted for the massive bipartisan budget compromise, despite years of preaching the gospel of small government and lowering federal spending. The deal boosted federal agency budgets more than $300 billion, pumped $91 billion into states hit by natural disasters, and, for good measure, suspended the limit on the national debt well past this year's midterm elections. To many observers it was a breathtaking contradiction, with some suggesting that there would be political consequences for their profligate spending and abandonment of what used to be a core principle. When Republicans are in power, it seems there is no conservative party. Senator Paul RKy said in a floor speech in which he also promised to delay a budget vote long enough to cause a brief government shutdown. The hypocrisy hangs in the air and chokes anyone with a sense of decency or intellectual honesty. Why would any party risk becoming such an easy target this close to an election, in which they are already running into a strong headwind? The answer is simple: because voter concern over surging deficits is at its lowest level in nearly a generation. Just 48% of voters said reducing the budget deficit should be a top priority, according to last month's Pew Research Center study. That does not rank among the top 10 most important issues, trailing improving race relations 52%, protecting the environment 62%, and improving education 72%, among other issues. And it's a dramatic drop from 5 years earlier, when 72% believed deficits were a top priority. It also represents the lowest share of Americans concerned about deficits since the months just after the Sept. 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. Other than that moment in modern history, you have to go back to the late 1990s to find a time when voters expressed such little concern about deficits, but that was when a surging economy led to annual surpluses and an effort at paying down the debt. Now, deficits are surging again. After falling below the $500 billion mark in 2015, deficit projections will top $1 trillion in the next few years. Yet voters in both parties have simply discounted the issue. Just 41% of Democrats and 59% of Republicans consider cutting the deficit a top priority, both sharp declines of more than 10 percentage points since the start of former President Barack Obama's second term in the White House. In this environment, supporting the budget-busting deal actually became an easy political vote, despite the inherent ideological contradictions. Indeed, Republicans are being coached to focus on selling the $1.5 trillion tax cuts ahead of the November elections because they believe that voters care overwhelmingly about their own wages. This also means that the success of the recently passed tax reform bill will be evaluated by the same standard, with the personal impact being the most important metric. David Winston and Myra Miller, co-founders of the Winston Group, a Republican research firm, wrote in a late January memo sent to GOP lawmakers and strategists. They cited a poll that asked voters to name the most important measure of the economy, and 59% said personal economic issues like income, wages, and cost of living. Next was economic figures such as growth rate, inflation, interest rates, but only 18% cited that as the top measure. This does not mean that these other economic measurements are unimportant in how people evaluate the economy. Winston and Miller wrote, but the ultimate metric will be the personal situation. This is why, listening to Democrats attack the GOP tax plan, there is very little talk of how Republicans are blowing a hole in the deficit. They know that voters have a blasé attitude about the national debt, now more than $20 trillion. Instead, Democrats are doing what Winston and Miller are urging Republicans to do, zeroing in on how the tax bill affects the middle and working class. They accuse Republicans and President Trump of crafting a plan that provides only brief, small relief to the vast majority of Americans while giving away permanent, multi-billion-dollar benefits to corporations and the wealthy. He told me he wouldn't support tax reform that benefited the very rich at the expense of the little guy. Senator Claire McCaskill, DMO, said of her discussions last year with Trump, The debt and deficit issue might be best understood as something that voters almost universally agree is a bad thing, but that very few consider in shaping the vote. It's akin to the federal minimum wage. Ask voters if the minimum wage should be raised from $7.25 an hour, and an overwhelming majority say yes. Yet the minimum wage never ranks as a top issue that determines how voters select their candidates. Even in 2010, as the Tea Party movement formed as a reaction to Obama's stimulus plan and the Affordable Care Act, it's not entirely clear how important government spending and deficits were in a midterm election that handed Republicans the House majority. In exit polling, more voters 34% said that the roughly $800 billion economic stimulus of 2009 hurt the economy than said it helped the economy 32%. But another 31% said it made no difference, so only a third of voters seemed concerned about that big spending plan. Voters were also asked what should be the top concern: cutting the deficit, cutting taxes, or spending more to create jobs. Cutting the deficit registered the highest of the three options with 40%. But almost 60% of voters, combined, wanted to cut taxes or spend more to create jobs, both policy positions that would bust the deficit. In his speech, Paul said he wanted to force Republicans to answer people at home about the hypocrisy. How come you were against President Obama's deficits, and then how come you're for Republican deficits? The answer is that they learned that people at home don't care all that much. Read more from Paul RKy's archive, follow him on Twitter or subscribe to his updates on Facebook.